This is a Chahoua Gecko, and today we're talking about breeding these guys. So before you decide that you want to breed Chahuas, you have to know what locality of Chahuas you want to breed. This is a very big issue in the Chahoua world. People do not like mixing localities. The two main localities you will find are going to be the Pine Island, like this girl here, and the mainland. There's another locale or two that are out there. They're mostly in Europe, but in the United States, what you're gonna find mostly is gonna be these Pine Islands. These are the most popular, and rightfully so. They have the prettiest colors, they're a little bit bigger in size, and they have a longer snout. So that's why they are more popular than the mainland. Mainlands though get very, very red coloration. Like the reddest mainland is definitely redder than the reddest Pine Island. So if you want to go for a red coloration, then go with the mainland. Another thing to keep into consideration when you're pairing up Chahuas or you're gonna go into breeding Chahuas is that these guys are not a good animal to invest in because they take a really long time to mature. The females are not always as reliable as some of the other gecko species we work with, and you never really want to look at one of these animals as an investment because you're just gonna get your heart broken. Things happen, animals die, animals don't lay eggs. It's just not the best way to do it. So if you're looking to breed Chahuas, I would definitely say go for it. If you love these animals, they are absolutely insane looking animals, especially those eyes and the camouflage they have. If you're passionate about them, go for it. If you're just doing it to, you know, make money, it's not your thing. They're a lot harder and you're gonna get weeded out right away. Now, the first thing you're gonna wanna know when you're breeding Chahuas is you need a male and a female. Now, they typically take about 3 years to sexually mature to be, you know, fully ready to breed. And the females will have a flat surface area right here, while the males will have a hemipenal bulge. Now this, what I have in my hands, is a male Chahoua. Now, Chahuas are not sexually dimorphic, so the darker doesn't mean male, lighter doesn't mean female, they just fire up and down. But the males will develop this hemipenal bulge right on the base of their tail, right after the vent, and that's how you will know they're a male. Typically, they start to develop this bulge at around 20-25 grams. Sometimes it takes them a year. Some develop a little bit earlier, some develop a little bit later, so it just depends on your animal and how fast they reach sexual maturity. Typically, if you have a fast-growing Chahoua, they're gonna develop a lot quicker than one that isn't developing as fast. So the first thing you want to get in check when you're deciding to breed Chahoua geckos is going to be the enclosure. Now there's multiple ways of doing it. There's a right and wrong way to doing, but there's also ways that are different that other breeders do differently than me, but this is how I do it. We breed our Chahoua in tubs. In 58 quart tubs, we keep a pair of Chahuas. Chahuas are not geckos that you could put in trios or one male with 3 females like some of the other gecko species. I have heard of mainland Chahuas being able to be kept in a community like that in a big enough enclosure, but for the most part, you're gonna hear about breeding Chahuas 1-to-1, 1.1, one male to one female. We keep them in a tub enclosure just like this. The substrate we use is just like, you know, all of our other care videos and husbandry videos. We use mulch, we use cork bark, and a fake plant in here. The important thing about Chahoua when you're deciding to keep them, to give them plenty of spaces that they could kind of get away from each other if it starts to get a little nasty between them. And you want them to feel secure. You want to create a lot of visual barriers, just like my other care videos. One thing that I will say that a lot of people swear by is UVB lighting. UVB lighting can be very useful when you're deciding to keep Chahoua in particular because these guys need tons and tons of calcium. Now, if you don't provide the amount of calcium that's necessary for the females, in one season after 2 or 4 eggs, you will see them crash right away. So it is super important that you're dusting your insects with calcium all the time. And that brings me to my next point. These guys are big, heavy cricket eaters and insect eaters in general. So it's not like a crested gecko that will do fine if you feed it crested gecko diet for the rest of its life. It will breed, no problem. These guys do need insects. They need that extra protein, that extra fat. So you want to feed these guys insects maybe 3 times a week at least, especially if you're breeding. 2 to 3 times a week is what I would say. 3 times being the optimal if you're breeding these guys. And make sure you always dust the crickets with calcium. Calcium with D3, we typically use every single time we feed because we don't have any UV on them. If you have UVB on them, then you want to use the calcium without D3 2 times a week and maybe calcium with D3 once a week. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. This is how we do it. If you've noticed some of our other videos, we like egg crates for most of our geckos, but with Chahuas, we like to give them a better structure. The cork rounds because they could actually hide in them. Now we provide these fake plants, these fake ferns, because they give a lot of visual barriers and they could kind of like feel more secure if they go inside in there. That's how they're gonna feel the most comfortable at. Now I do include this lay box in there. You know, most of the time Chahoua, for whatever reason, don't even lay inside the lay box. We still want to provide it just in case to help preserve the eggs. So sometimes if they lay them outside, they could dry up quicker if we don't get to them right away. I give them a lay box, cork bark, visual barriers, and that's how we house them. All right, so what we have in these lay boxes is the standard sphagnum moss that we use in all of our egg boxes, but the difference is that Chahuas rarely ever dig and bury their eggs. If there were to be eggs in here, they would most likely just be sitting at the top. Now, the interesting thing about Chahoua is that they will actually guard their egg for a day or two right after the lay-em. So if she had just laid eggs in there, the female will be here and she'd be trying to bite me for trying to go after her eggs. They can be territorial, especially when you go into their enclosure without basically warning them first. That definitely transfers over to the females when they lay eggs. So it's very interesting. Not a lot of other gecko species are, you know, protective of the eggs, but they are. Pairing Chahoua could be kind of interesting because they're not quite as picky as lychees, but they definitely don't get along as easy as crested or gargoyle geckos. Like I say with some of my other gecko species and other breeding of other gecko species, is you want to pair these guys typically when their metabolism is a little bit slower. That means when they're cooler, in the cooler months, they're not eating as much, they're not as active, because that's going to give you the best chance of them being compatible. Pine Island Chahuas in particular have more compatibility issues than the mainland Chahuas, but once they stay together, they are pretty solid. And for example, this girl here, Seaweed, and her boy Pitbull, I've had for since they've been breeding, I think since 2008 or even before that. In 2008 they started breeding, and to this day they're still producing eggs and they're still living together. It's really interesting to see geckos that typically geckos will breed with any female, you know, the males and the females will allow any male to breed them. They could be a little bit more picky than your average crested gecko. Not as much as the lychees, but you know, still very interesting. Once you do pair these guys up, you want to make sure that you pair them up in a completely brand new enclosure. That's what I've always done. That's what I recommend. I don't like putting the female in the male's enclosure or the male in the female's enclosure because, like I said, they are territorial and sometimes they could get nippy. Some of the worst gecko injuries I have ever seen in my life have been due to Chahoua. So you want to make sure that you pair these guys up appropriately. You don't want to get these guys to start fighting each other because one night to another they could kill each other. I've actually had that happen. That brings me to my next point. If you guys are interested in, you know, a more in-depth view of how I breed and how I pair all my Chahuas and lychees and some of the other geckos, make sure you sign up for our Gecko Breeders Masterclass in our membership program here on YouTube. All right, so I'm looking for some Chahoua eggs to show you guys. Oh, look at that. Axanthic just hatched. How cool is that? That's an axanthic crested gecko. You can see the clear difference with the black and the gray and the pure white on this one and then a regular one right here. That's dope. But we're talking Chahuas, so let's find a Chahoua egg. Perfect. So look at the size difference between gargoyle eggs are still pretty big, but these are Chahoua eggs. This one here is a Chahoua egg. You can see the clear difference between a gargoyle egg and the Chahoua eggs. And I know you can't feel them, but Chahoua eggs, for whatever reason, they tend to be thicker. They tend to be like more calcified. So the crested gecko eggs and the gargoyle gecko eggs will have kind of like a flexible shell. the Chahoua eggs are much harder, and that is why Chahuas have some of the lowest hatch rate of all the New Caledonian geckos, because you know, this shell is not easy to crack. Good thing about that though is that when a Chahoua does hatch, typically they never die. They're so vigorous and so ready to live and to kick ass in life that they're not gonna pass away. So baby Chahuas, I can't even say that I've ever lost a baby Chahoua actually, but you know, baby gargles or baby cresses, sometimes they hatch weak. The eggs are considerably bigger, and I want to show you how we incubate them. So first things first, what you want to do is you want to get some sort of incubation medium. Now what we use is these rock type, you know, pebbles that you see here. This is called Repashy. What's it called? Repashy, having a brain fart. Repashy Super Hatch. So this is called Repashy Super Hatch, and the good thing about this incubation medium is that you could reuse it. You could boil this whenever all these hatch, and you wanna, if it gets dirty or whatever from like egg yolk or whatever, you could boil it, you know, sanitize it, and then reuse it. It also will tell you if the substrate is too dry or if it's just right. You see the color that it has here? It's a darker color. This means that the substrate is well hydrated, and it's going to retain that humidity for the duration of the eggs being in here, and that's going to obviously not let the eggs dry out. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is either keeping the substrate too wet or too dry. When this thing dries out, you could tell because it turns like a light brown. Then you know, okay, this is starting to get too dry. Maybe I gotta add a little bit of water. There's a caveat to that. You don't wanna just add water on here. Ideally, you wanna seal this thing, have 1 or 2 holes, and that's it, and forget about it and let them hatch on their own. If you have too many holes, it's gonna get too dry too quickly. If you don't have any holes, it's going to create mold on the eggs. This is how we incubate them. We incubate them at room temperature, and Chahuas typically take a little bit longer than crested or gargle geckos. Now, for let's say like 80 days or 90 days that a crested gecko might take, the Chahoua could take 100 or even 120 days. You have to have a little bit more patience, but this is exactly how we incubate them. So one thing to keep in mind with Chahoua is that they typically only lay 2 to 4, 5 clutches, the absolute max in a season. And that takes a very big toll on them. So what I like to have handy all the time is liquid calcium. Now you could get this stuff online. You could get this stuff maybe at your vet's office. I think the scientific name is calcium gluconate. This is something, it's a calcium that's easier to absorb than your regular powdered calcium. And I like to hit my girls with some liquid calcium maybe a couple times during the season, especially after they laid a couple of clutches of eggs. Besides the liquid calcium, like I was saying earlier, their nutrition is going to be super important. Making sure you gut load the insects properly and that you dust with calcium every single feeding is ideal. It's a must when you're breeding these Chahuas. The first signs of MBD that you will see with Chahuas is a kinking up in the tail of the females. Typically, you'll start to see their tail base start to indent really badly, and then lastly, you might see an underbite develop or overbite develop, or even some kinking in the spine. Obviously, you would never want to let it get to that point. If you start to see a little bit of a wavy tail in one of your breeder female Chahoua, then that's when you hit her with that liquid calcium. Make sure that she's getting her bugs. I don't necessarily have to separate any of my Chahuas unless they fight. I leave my Chahuas together all year. If the female is really bad, then you're gonna have to do that. Luckily though, you know, we haven't had that issue because of experience. Now I kind of know what to look out for, but you don't need to go through a male killing a female or a female developing MBD for you to learn this stuff. So make sure you pay attention to your animals, especially if you only have 2 or 3 groups of Chahuas or 1 pair of Chahuas that you're breeding. Make sure you're on that group all the time. Take a look at them, inspect your females, because once they start to crash, it could be very bad for these girls. That is my last tip on how to breed Chahoua, guys. These animals are absolutely amazing. They're definitely a little bit more of a experienced keeper, or I would say experienced breeder gecko. But as far as like husbandry goes, and as far as the type of pet that they make an excellent pet, and that's why they're so popular. I absolutely love these guys. I hope you guys do too. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and we'll see you guys on the next one. See you on the next one.